There comes a moment in life when everything you've built comes crashing down, and you're left wondering if you'll ever find solid ground again. Vincent Aldridge knew that feeling all too well. At 52, after losing his marriage and his job, he took what little he had left and drove into the woods. He found a narrow clearing between two massive stone cliffs and decided to start over. His family mocked him. They said he was running away, that he'd lost his mind. But Vincent simply picked up a hammer and began to build. What he created in that hidden place would eventually silence every critic and prove something powerful about second chances. But what did his daughter discover when she finally visited that made her see her father in a completely new light? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, subscribe, because tomorrow we've saved something extra special for you. Vincent Aldridge had been a construction manager for 23 years, overseeing projects that would outlast him: shopping centers, office buildings, apartment complexes that dotted the suburbs like monuments to other people's dreams. He'd been good at his job, reliable in the way a sturdy bolt is reliable, holding things together without fanfare or recognition. For 25 years, he'd also been a husband, though somewhere around year 15, he and Barbara had stopped being partners and started being roommates who shared a mortgage and occasional meals. They had 2 children, Shelley, now 30, and working as a dental hygienist 3 states away, and Keith, 28, who'd taken a finance job in Singapore and called home twice a year if they were lucky. The divorce shouldn't have surprised anyone, least of all Vincent. Barbara's affair with her yoga instructor had been the official reason, but the truth was simpler and sadder. They'd both stopped trying years before. The settlement took everything. The house they'd paid on for 2 decades, half his retirement, most of his savings. Vincent signed the papers in a lawyer's office that smelled like stale coffee and resignation, and when he walked out, he felt lighter and emptier at the same time. Then came the layoffs. His company, facing a contracted market and tightening budgets, let go of middle management first. Vincent received a severance package that seemed generous until he divided it by the months it would need to last. He moved into a studio apartment in a complex where the walls were thin enough to hear his neighbor's television game shows and arguments with her cat. He'd lie awake at night, staring at water stains on the ceiling that looked like continents he'd never visit, and wonder when his life had become so small. His family gathered for Sunday dinners at his older sister Loretta's house, a pristine colonial with landscaping that looked professionally anxious. Loretta sold real estate and measured success in square footage and school district ratings. Her husband drove a German sedan and smiled with all his teeth but none of his eyes. His younger brother Stanley had a dental practice and 3 kids in private school. Stanley's wife collected awards from charity galas like some people collected refrigerator magnets. His youngest sister Gwendolyn ran an elementary school and had that particular brand of capable exhaustion that comes from spending all day managing other people's children. At these dinners, Vincent became the cautionary tale, served alongside the roasted chicken and potatoes. "Well, at least I'm not starting over at 52, someone would say, not quite looking at him. "At least I didn't throw away a perfectly good career," another would add, as if Vincent had simply been careless with something valuable. Loretta was the worst, her concerns sharpened into weapons. "Have you thought about retail? I heard they're hiring at the home improvement store. You know about construction, right?" She'd say it brightly as if she were helping. His mother Hazel, 78 and increasingly frail, would pat his hand and tell him things would work out. But even her optimism had started to sound like wishful thinking. His children called less frequently. Shelley's conversations were strained with the effort of finding something positive to say. Keith stopped answering most of his messages entirely. One sleepless night in April, Vincent remembered something he hadn't thought about in decades. He was 8 years old, camping with his grandfather in the mountains. They'd hiked for hours until they found a meadow ringed by pines, and his grandfather had shown him how to build a fire, how to read the stars, how to be still enough that the forest forgot you were there. "Sometimes, Vincent," his grandfather had said, whittling a piece of cedar with a knife older than either of them, "a man needs to strip everything down to see what's actually holding him up." The memory settled in Vincent's chest, like a compass finding north. He spent the next week liquidating what little he had left. Furniture went to a consignment shop, clothes to charity, books to a library sale. He kept his grandfather's hammer, a sleeping bag, a camp stove, and his tools. He bought a 20-year-old pickup truck from a mechanic who looked at him with something like understanding and asked no questions. Then he drove west, away from the city, away from Sunday dinners and thin-walled apartments, towards something he couldn't name but desperately needed to find. He drove for 3 days, taking back roads through small towns that looked like they'd been preserved in amber since 1985. He slept in the truck bed and ate at diners where the coffee was strong and the waitresses called everyone honey without irony. On the 4th day, he took a wrong turn down a fire road that seemed to lead nowhere, the kind of mistake that in another life would have frustrated him. But something made him keep going. The road narrowed until it was barely more than tire tracks through pine needles and fallen leaves. Then it ended entirely at a small clearing. Vincent got out, intending to turn around when he saw them. 2 massive stone formations rising from the earth like ancient sentinels. They were easily 40 feet tall, weathered by centuries into smooth, curved faces that looked almost deliberate. Between them lay a clearing, perhaps 40 feet wide and 80 feet long, sheltered and silent. A creek ran along the eastern edge, clear and cold, murmuring over smooth stones. The ground was mostly level, carpeted with pine needles and patches of moss. Sunlight filtered through the canopy overhead, creating patterns that shifted with the breeze. Vincent stood there for a long time, listening. No traffic sounds, no neighbors, no televisions through thin walls. Just wind in the pines, water over rocks, and birdsong he couldn't identify. He walked the perimeter slowly, his construction manager's eye automatically assessing. The stones would provide natural windbreaks. The southern exposure was good for solar gain. The creek meant water. The soil, where he could see it beneath the needles, looked stable enough for building. Some distant professional part of his brain was already sketching foundation lines and load calculations. That night, he pitched his tent in the clearing and made a small fire. The stars emerged one by one, visible between the stone walls like jewels in a setting. He lay in his sleeping bag, listening to the creek and the forest settling into darkness, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of quiet. Not emptiness, but space. In the morning, he drove to the nearest town, a place called Millerton, that consisted of 2 gas stations, a hardware store, a diner, and a post office that doubled as the library. At the county office, a tired-looking clerk helped him research the land. It was state-owned, technically public domain, abandoned decades ago when a logging road project fell through. He filed for a temporary land use permit, paid the minimal fee, and drove back to the clearing with a sense of purpose he'd forgotten he could feel. He unloaded his tools, organized his supplies, and stood looking at the space between the stones. In his pocket was a photograph, the only one he'd kept, of his family at Shelley's college graduation. Everyone smiling, everyone together, everything still intact on the surface. He looked at it once, then put it away. That life was over. This one, whatever it would become, was just beginning. The first 2 weeks passed in a rhythm that Vincent's body remembered, even if his mind had forgotten. Wake with the sun, boil water for instant coffee over the camp stove, eat oatmeal that tasted like cardboard but filled the stomach. Then work, clearing brush, moving stones, mapping the clearing with stakes and string. His hands blistered, then calloused. His back ached in new ways that felt paradoxically good, like his spine was remembering its original purpose. He sketched plans on paper torn from a notebook, using techniques he'd learned in his first construction job 30 years ago. The cabin would be small, 16 feet by 24, with a sleeping loft and a single main room. He'd use the stone cliffs as the back walls, building the structure into the natural shelter they provided. It wouldn't be fancy, but it would be solid. More importantly, it would be his. The physical exhaustion brought something he hadn't experienced since the divorce: dreamless sleep. He'd collapse into his sleeping bag each night and disappear into unconsciousness so complete it felt like mercy. The only sounds were the creak and the occasional rustle of something moving through the underbrush. No arguments through walls, no sirens, no constant hum of other people's lives pressing against his own. On the 10th day, his phone rang. He'd almost forgotten he still had it, kept charged by a small solar panel he'd rigged to the truck battery. Shelley's name appeared on the screen, and he felt his chest tighten before he answered. "Dad, finally. I've been trying to reach you for 3 days." Her voice carried that particular edge of worry that made him feel simultaneously loved and guilty. "Sorry, sweetheart. Signal's spotty out here." "Out where?" "Where are you?" Vincent looked around at the clearing, at the stakes marking his foundation, at the pile of salvaged materials he'd started collecting. "I'm taking some time. In the mountains. Needed to clear my head." There was a pause that lasted too long. "Dad, are you okay?" "Really? I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. He struggled for words that wouldn't sound crazy. "I'm building something." Another pause. "Building what?" "A cabin. A small place. Just for me." "A cabin." Her tone had shifted from worried to alarmed. "Dad, you're living in the woods?" "It's not like that. I found this clearing, it's beautiful, and I just thought..." "You just thought you'd run away and live like a hermit." The words stung more than it should have. "I'm not running away." "What do you call it then?" She was crying now, he could hear it. "You lost everything, and instead of dealing with it, you're hiding in the forest building a shack?" "Shelley, I have to tell Mom and Aunt Loretta. They need to know where you are. Please don't." But she'd already hung up. Vincent stood holding the dead phone, feeling the peace of the last 10 days evaporate like morning fog. He'd known this moment would come, but he'd hoped for more time. Time to have something to show, some proof that this wasn't madness but purpose. The call came 2 days later, a conference call with all 3 of his siblings. He could picture them. Loretta on her leather couch, Stanley in his home office, Gwendolyn probably at her kitchen table with papers spread around her. All of them unified in their concern, which felt more like judgment. "Vincent, we're worried about you." That was Gwendolyn, the diplomat. "And I'm fine." "I told Shelley, you're 52 years old living in a tent." Loretta cutting straight through. "Do you hear yourself?" "I hear myself fine. I'm building a cabin, getting back to basics." "There's nothing wrong with that." "There's everything wrong with it." Stanley's voice, clinical and certain. "This is exactly the behavior Barbara described. You never face reality. You always run." The words landed like physical blows. "I faced reality for 25 years. I faced it every day in that marriage, in that job. Maybe I'm done facing other people's version of reality. Listen to yourself." Loretta again. "You sound unhinged. You need professional help, Vincent. You need to come back to the city, see someone, get your life together." "My life is together. More together than it's been in years. Living in the woods like some kind of survivalist is not having your life together," Stanley said. "Think about your kids. Think about Mom. She's beside herself with worry." That hurt more than he wanted to admit. "I'll call Mom, but I'm not coming back." "Then we're done." Loretta's voice had gone cold. "If you want to throw away what's left of your life, we can't stop you. But we're not going to watch it happen. Come back within a week or don't bother calling." The line went dead. Vincent sat on a log he'd dragged near his tent, the phone still pressed to his ear, like he might hear something different if he waited long enough. Around him, the clearing remained unchanged. The stones standing their silent vigil, the creek continuing its ancient conversation with itself. Nothing here cared about his failures or his family's disappointment. Nothing here measured him against any standard except his own ability to show up and do the work. 3 days later, Shelley drove up the fire road in her Honda. Vincent heard the engine long before he saw the car, an intrusion of mechanical sound that didn't belong here. She got out wearing jeans and a sweater, her face tight with worry and something else, maybe anger, maybe fear. "I had to see it for myself," she said, not bothering with hello. He showed her around, pointing out the foundation stakes, explaining his plans. She listened in silence, arms crossed, expression unreadable. When he finished, she handed him an envelope. From Aunt Loretta. She wanted me to give it to you in person. Vincent opened it there, standing in the clearing with his daughter watching. The letter was typed, formal, devastating in its precision. He was embarrassing the family. He was embarrassing himself. His mother was heartbroken. He needed professional help. This fantasy he was living would only make everything worse. If he cared about any of them at all, he would come back, face his problems, and stop running. He read it twice, feeling each word like a paper cut, small, sharp, collectively unbearable. Shelley was crying now, silent tears running down her face. "Dad, please, just come back. Live with me for a while. We'll figure something out." He looked at his daughter, his beautiful, worried daughter, who loved him enough to drive 3 hours and cry in the woods. Then he looked at the clearing, at the work he'd started, at the first real choice he'd made in decades. "I can't," he said quietly. "I know how it looks. I know it sounds crazy. But Shelley, I've been dead for years, just going through motions, playing a part. Here I feel alive again. You feel alive living in a tent?" The pain in her voice nearly broke him. "I feel like myself, for the first time in longer than I can remember." She left an hour later, still crying, and Vincent watched her car disappear down the fire road until the forest swallowed the sound of her engine. Then he walked back to the clearing, took Loretta's letter, and burned it in his campfire. He watched the paper curl and blacken, the words turning to ash and smoke. The next morning, he walked the 12 miles to Millerton and bought detailed survey maps. He spent 2 days researching land law at the library. He filed paperwork, made phone calls, documented everything. When he returned to the clearing, he had a temporary land use permit and a plan. They wanted him to come back. He was going forward instead. He picked up his grandfather's hammer, felt its familiar weight, and drove the first stake for the foundation. The sound echoed off the stone cliffs, sharp, clear, definitive. Not running away. Building toward, Vincent discovered Maurice's salvage yard on his second trip to Millerton, tucked behind a stand of cottonwoods like a secret the town was keeping. The yard sprawled across 2 acres of organized chaos. Stacks of lumber, sorted by dimension. Piles of windows leaning against a corrugated metal shed. Bathtubs and sinks lined up like patients waiting for diagnosis. A hand-painted sign read, "Maurice's Reclamation. One man's trash is my paycheck." Maurice himself was 68, built like a fire hydrant, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same wood he sold. He eyed Vincent with the particular suspicion reserved for city folk who thought they could play at country living. "Looking for something specific or just browsing?" His voice sounded like gravel in a mixer. "I need materials for a cabin, 16 by 24. Looking to salvage what I can, buy what I must." Maurice's eyebrow lifted. "Doing it yourself?" "Yes, sir. Where?" Vincent hesitated, then decided honesty might serve him better than evasion. "Found a clearing about 18 miles north, between 2 rock formations. Filing for a land use permit." Something shifted in Maurice's expression, not quite approval, but a softening of the initial skepticism. "The old stone pass? I know it. Good spot. Held to get materials to, though. I've got a truck. You've got experience? 23 years as a construction manager." Maurice studied him for a long moment, then nodded toward a massive oak beam lying across sawhorses. "That came out of a barn built in 1887, solid as the day it was milled. Been trying to sell it for 2 years. Too heavy for most weekend warriors, too rustic for contractors. But for a cabin in the stones, that'd be your center support." Vincent ran his hand along the beam. The wood was dense, seasoned by more than a century, barely a crack in it. "What do you want for it?" 3 days' work. I need help sorting the metal pile out back. Separate the steel from the aluminum, copper by itself. Job's been haunting me for months." They shook on it. Vincent spent the next 3 days in the salvage yard, working from sunrise to mid-afternoon. His hands learning the weight and feel of different metals, his back protesting, then accepting the labor. Maurice worked beside him, mostly silent, occasionally offering observations about materials or construction techniques or the general foolishness of humanity. On the third day, as they loaded the beam into Vincent's truck, Morris said, "There's a barn demolition next week over in Coopersville. Owner's paying to have it torn down, but he said I can keep whatever I salvage." "I could use help," Vincent went. Then he went to an estate sale, where a woman's late husband's workshop was being liquidated. Then to a farm where a windstorm had damaged a shed. Each time he traded labor for materials, windows, doors, copper piping, sheet metal for roofing. Each time, Maurice introduced him to someone else, building a network that operated on barter and handshakes and the currency of reliable work. The people in Millerton began to recognize him. The waitress at the diner, whose name was Beverly and who'd raised 3 kids on tips and grit, started bringing him coffee before he ordered. The hardware store owner, Beatrice, offered him contractor pricing without him asking. A rancher named Floyd stopped by the salvage yard one afternoon and told Maurice, but made sure Vincent could hear, that he had cedar planks from fallen trees if someone wanted to mill them. These people didn't care that he was divorced or unemployed or living in a tent. They cared that he showed up when he said he would, worked hard and didn't complain. Out here, his story wasn't shameful. It was familiar. Almost everyone knew someone who'd lost everything and had to start over. The only shame was in not trying. Back at the clearing, Vincent began the foundation work. He marked the corners with stakes and string, checking and rechecking the measurements until his eyes burned. 16 by 24, with the back wall flush against the space between the stones. He dug the trenches by hand, 3 feet deep, wide enough for concrete footings. His shoulders screamed. His lower back felt like someone had replaced his vertebrae with broken glass. But every evening, sitting by his fire with a can of beans and instant coffee, he could see the progress. The trenches getting deeper, the pile of materials growing, the dream becoming something he could measure in feet and inches. He sent Shelley a photograph of the foundation stakes, no message attached. She replied, "Dad, please be careful." 3 weeks in, the storm came. He'd been watching the sky all afternoon, seeing the clouds build up over the mountains like dark thoughts gathering mass. The first drops hit as he was securing his tent. Then the sky opened up completely. Rain fell in sheets so thick he couldn't see the stone cliffs 20 feet away. Wind tore through the clearing, bending the pines into impossible angles. His tent collapsed on one side, water pouring through the seams, soaking his sleeping bag and clothes. He spent the night in his truck, watching through the rain-streaked windshield as his foundation trenches became streams, the careful corners he'd dug washing away in muddy rivulets. Hours of work disappearing as he watched, helpless and cold and suddenly devastatingly tired. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the clearing washed clean but transformed. 2 days of work gone. The northeast corner of his foundation completely undone, the soil slumped and saturated. Vincent stood in the mud, looking at the damage, and felt something dangerous rising in his chest, the urge to quit, to call Loretta, to admit she'd been right all along. But there was nowhere to go back to. No home, no job, no marriage. Just that apartment with thin walls and Sunday dinners full of pity. The choice wasn't between this and something better. It was between this and nothing. He started rebuilding the corner. This time he dug deeper, laid gravel for drainage, built a small berm to redirect water. He worked through the day, through his exhaustion and doubt, through the voice in his head that sounded suspiciously like his ex-wife saying he never finished anything. Maurice showed up around 3 in the afternoon, driving his ancient pickup with a tarp and a thermos of coffee. He looked at the damage, looked at Vincent's rebuilt corner and nodded once. "Storm's a teacher," he said, handing Vincent the thermos. "Shows you what you did wrong so you can do it right." They worked together until dark, reinforcing the other corners, improving the drainage throughout. Maurice didn't offer platitudes or encouragement. He just worked, and his presence said everything that needed saying. "You're not alone in this." That night, Vincent lay in his half-collapsed tent, listening to water drip from the pines, and realized something had shifted. The storm hadn't defeated him. It had educated him. Every setback was just information, every failure just a rough draft. He wasn't running from his old life anymore. He was building toward a new one choice and one nail at a time. In the morning, he drove to Millerton and bought concrete mix. Then he came back and poured the footings, watching the thick grey mixture settle into the trenches he'd dug and rebuilt. Permanent now, committed, the foundation of something that would last. 6 weeks after driving the first stake, Vincent stood on a completed floor platform, feeling the solid planks beneath his feet like affirmation. The salvaged oak beam stretched across the center, supported by posts sunk deep into concrete footings. He'd spent 3 days getting it into position, using a come-along and a system of ropes and pulleys that Morris had helped him rig. When it finally settled into place, level and true, Vincent had sat down on the platform and laughed, the first real laugh he could remember in years. The wall frames went up next. Built on the ground and raised section by section, he'd designed them to integrate with the stone cliffs, using the natural rock as the back walls. The stones held the cool of the earth, radiating it into the space. In summer, the cabin would stay naturally cooler. In winter, once he got a stove installed, the mass would hold heat like a battery. He worked with the careful precision of someone who understood that mistakes at this stage would haunt him later. Every joint checked twice, every measurement verified. His bubble level broke on the fourth wall, and rather than drive to town, he made a water level from clear tubing and a bucket, a trick his grandfather had shown him as a boy. It worked perfectly, and he felt unreasonably proud of the solution, this small proof that he could adapt and improvise. Windows went in, where morning light would reach the kitchen area and where he could see the creek from inside. The glass panes came from an old greenhouse, wavy and imperfect, but they caught the light in ways modern windows never did. Each one was slightly different, giving the cabin a face that seemed hand-drawn rather than manufactured. On a Saturday morning in early June, Shelley arrived unannounced. Vincent heard her car coming up the fire road and felt his stomach tighten with old anxiety. But when she got out, she was carrying a cooler and wearing jeans with actual dirt on them from some previous adventure. "Brought lunch," she said, looking past him at the cabin frame. "Dad. Oh my God." He'd forgotten that she'd only seen the stakes and sketches. Now there was an actual structure, walls, roof framing, windows that caught the morning sun. It looked like a cabin. It looked like a home. "You built this by yourself?" "Maurice helped with the beam, but yeah, mostly myself." She walked around it slowly, running her hand along the wood, testing the sturdiness of the posts. Vincent watched her, trying to read her expression. When she turned back, her eyes were wet. "It's beautiful, Dad." They ate sandwiches sitting on the platform, legs dangling over the edge. Shelley asked questions about the construction, and Vincent explained his choices, his compromises, his small victories. The conversation flowed easier than it had in years, lubricated by shared focus on something tangible and real. "I need to tell you something," Shelley said, staring at her sandwich. "About Mom." Vincent waited. Her boyfriend left, the yoga instructor. Turns out he was also sleeping with 2 other women in the class. She's pretty devastated. Vincent felt a complicated swirl of emotions. Not vindication, but not quite sympathy either. Just a kind of sad recognition that broken things were everywhere, that pain didn't play favorites. "I'm sorry she's going through that." "Are you?" Shelley looked at him directly. "She hurt you. She left. Part of me thinks she deserves it." "Nobody deserves that kind of pain, sweetheart, not even someone who caused you pain." They sat in silence, for a while, listening to the creek and the wind in the pines. Finally, Shelley said, "The divorce wasn't all her fault, was it?" It was the kind of question that deserved an honest answer, even if honesty was uncomfortable. "No, it takes 2 people to kill a marriage. I was checked out for years, went to work, came home, sat in front of the TV. I loved your mum, but I stopped showing up for her, stopped seeing her. She didn't have an affair because I was a terrible person. She had one because she was lonely in a marriage that should have kept her from being lonely. Shelley's tears fell freely now. "I spent so much time being angry at her, at both of you, for blowing up our family. Our family wasn't working, honey. Sometimes things need to break before they can be fixed, or before people can fix themselves." He gestured at the cabin. "I couldn't have built this while I was still in that life. I needed everything to fall apart first. Can I come back, help you finish it?" "I'd like that." She came back the next weekend and the one after that. They worked side by side, installing roof planks, adding trim, building a loft frame. The physical labor opened up spaces for conversation that sitting across a table never had. They talked about the divorce, about her own struggles with relationships, about Keith's emails from Singapore that suggested he wasn't as happy as his Instagram posts implied. Word continued to spread in Millerton about the man building between the stones. A hunter stopped by one afternoon, studied the cabin with the critical eye of someone who knew construction, and tipped his hat. "Fine work," he said. And that was all. But Vincent felt the approval settle in his chest like warmth. Beatrice from the hardware store started calling him by name, asking about his progress, offering advice about weatherproofing and insulation. Floyd the rancher brought him cedar planks milled from fallen trees on his property, refusing payment. "You're doing something real out here," Floyd said. "That's worth supporting." Vincent invited to a community potluck at the church social hall, his first real social event since the divorce. He almost didn't go, self-conscious about his appearance, his story, his questionable life choices. But Morris insisted, and Vincent found himself in a room full of people who'd rebuilt after losses of their own. Farms foreclosed, businesses failed, spouses lost to disease or disaster. They shared food and stories, and nobody asked probing questions about why he was living in the woods. They just accepted that sometimes life requires radical revision. An older woman named Gladys, who'd lost her husband and farm in the same year, told him, "Out here, we measure folks different than they do in the city. We don't care what you lost. We care what you do with what's left." Driving back to the clearing that night, Vincent understood something fundamental had shifted. His family measured success in titles and bank accounts and maintaining appearances. These people measured it in showing up, in helping your neighbors, in doing what you said you'd do. Their respect wasn't conditional on his recovery from failure. It was based on his willingness to try. The cabin's exterior was complete by mid-July. He stood back one evening, looking at it in the golden light, and felt something he'd stopped believing he could feel. Pride. Not the ego-driven pride of status or achievement, but the quiet satisfaction of having built something with his own hands, something solid and true. He took a photograph and sent it to Shelley with a simple message. "We did good." She replied immediately. "We really did, Dad. When can I visit again?" 3 months into the build, Vincent had developed routines that felt as natural as breathing. Wake with the first light filtering between the stones, boil water for coffee on the wood stove he'd installed himself, stand on the porch he'd just finished, and watch the world emerge from darkness. The clearing had its own rhythms, birds at dawn, insects at midday, the creek's constant conversation with itself. He'd become part of that rhythm rather than an intrusion into it. The interior work consumed his days now. Insulation between the studs, interior walls of reclaimed tongue-and-groove planks that Floyd had milled. Each board had to be fitted individually, planned and sanded until it slid into place with satisfying precision. The work was meditative, requiring enough focus to quiet his mind, but not so much that he couldn't think. In the evenings, after the light became too dim for construction, he discovered whittling. It started by accident, a piece of scrap cedar, his grandfather's old pocket knife, and idle hands by the fire. The first attempt was crude, barely recognizable as the bird he'd intended. But there was something soothing about the repetition, the slow revelation of form from formless wood. He'd carved 7 birds by the time his mother visited in late August. Hazel insisted on coming despite his siblings' protests, and Stanley drove her up in his spotless SUV, clearly uncomfortable the entire way. Vincent watched them navigate the fire road, Stanley's face tight with concentration and disapproval. Hazel got out slowly, using her walker, and stood looking at the cabin with an expression Vincent couldn't immediately read. She was smaller than he remembered, more fragile, but her eyes were sharp as ever. "Well," she said finally, "show me." He gave her the tour, explaining each choice, why he'd positioned the windows here, how the stone walls provided insulation, where the sleeping loft would hold heat in winter. She listened without interruption, running her hand along the salvaged beam, testing the sturdiness of the railing he'd built for the loft stairs. Stanley trailed behind them, silent and skeptical. When they finished, Hazel sat in the single chair Vincent had built, a simple design from a magazine, surprisingly comfortable, and looked around with something like wonder. "Your grandfather would have been so proud," she said quietly. The words hit Vincent harder than he expected. Stanley made a noise that might have been disagreement, and Hazel turned to him with unexpected sharpness. "Don't start, Stanley. This is beautiful work. This has love in it, which is more than I can say for your big house, with nothing in it but furniture and loneliness." Stanley's face flushed. "Ma, it's still just a shack in the woods. It's more than that, and you know it. Your brother built this with his own hands. When's the last time you built anything that wasn't on paper?" They sat by the creek for lunch. Sandwiches Hazel had insisted on making, even though Stanley had wanted to stop at a restaurant. She ate slowly, asking Vincent about his days, his plans for winter, whether he was truly happy or just pretending. "I'm happy, Ma. I know it looks strange from the outside, but I feel more like myself than I have in decades." She patted his hand with her papery fingers. "That's all I ever wanted for any of you. To know who you are and be at peace with it." She glanced at Stanley. "Some of your siblings never figured that out. They're so busy looking successful they forgot to actually live." Before they left, Hazel pulled Vincent aside. "Loretta is hardest on you because she's scared. She doesn't know how to measure a life except by money and titles. Seeing you happy with so little terrifies her, means she might have been chasing the wrong things all along." Stanley's parting words, as he helped Hazel into the SUV, were grudging but genuine. "You do good work, Vince, I'll give you that." It was the first acknowledgement Vincent had received from his family that he might be doing something right, and it sustained him through the harder preparations ahead. September arrived with cooler nights and the first hints of gold in the aspen leaves. Vincent began winterizing in earnest. He installed weather stripping around the door and windows, added extra insulation in the loft, built a lean-to for firewood storage. Maurice helped him install a small solar panel system, used equipment from a foreclosed cabin, but functional. Enough power for lights, phone charging, and a small refrigerator he'd bought second-hand. "Winter up here is no joke," Maurice warned, showing him how to maintain the batteries, how to conserve power when clouds block the sun. "You sure about this?" Vincent looked at the cabin, at the work he'd done, at the life he'd built from nothing. "I'm sure." The wood stove became his evening companion. He'd spend hours feeding it, watching the flames dance behind the glass door, the heat radiating through the cabin and into the stone walls. The stones absorbed the warmth during the day and released it at night, turning the walls into thermal batteries. The engineering worked better than he'd dared hope. His body had changed over the months. He'd lost 30 pounds without trying, the soft, middle-aged spread replaced by muscle that came from actual use. His hands were permanently calloused now, scarred from various small accidents, a nail gun mishap, a saw that slipped, splinters that went deep. Each mark was a story, a lesson learned. More than the physical transformation, something had shifted internally. The constant anxiety that had hummed beneath his life for years was gone. The need to check his phone every few minutes, to worry about what people thought, to measure himself against some external standard, all of it had fallen away like dead skin. Here, in this clearing between ancient stones, he'd found something he'd stopped believing existed: peace. He built a front porch in October, 6 feet deep, covered, a place to sit and watch the seasons change. He carved his name above the door, not as ego but as signature, a maker's mark on something he'd created. The first night he slept in the completed loft, looking up through the skylight at stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. He felt a contentment so profound it was almost painful. Shelley visited twice more before winter set in fully, bringing her partner both times, a quiet man named Greg, who taught high school history and seemed genuinely impressed by the cabin. They helped Vincent finish the interior trim, install shelving, build a small table. The work was easier with extra hands, but more than that, Vincent appreciated the company, the sense of family that felt chosen rather than obligated. On their last visit before snow made the road impassable, Shelley handed him a small wooden box she'd made in a craft class. Inside was the first bird he'd carved, the crude one he'd almost thrown away. "I want you to keep this," she said, "to remember where you started." He placed it on the shelf above the stove, where he'd see it every day. A reminder that everything starts rough, that skill comes from practice, that transformation is always possible if you're willing to do the work. The first snow came in early November, silent and transforming. Vincent woke to a world muffled in white, the clearing unrecognizable beneath 6 inches of powder. The stone cliffs stood darker against the pale sky, their ancient faces dusted with snow that clung to every crevice and ledge. The creek still ran, though ice had begun to form along its edges, creating delicate sculptures that caught the morning light. The cabin held heat remarkably well. The wood stove radiated warmth that the stone walls absorbed and returned through the night. He'd wake in the loft to temperatures that were almost comfortable, even when his breath frosted in the air. The morning routine expanded, checking the stove, adding wood, melting snow for washing water, since the creek's edge had frozen solid. Days took on a different quality in winter. The work was maintenance now rather than construction, keeping paths clear, ensuring the roof shed snow properly, making sure ice didn't dam the small gutters he'd rigged. The isolation was profound. Morris had warned him the fire road would be impassable once the heavy snows came, and by mid-November that prediction proved accurate. Vincent was alone with the forest and the silence. He'd prepared for this, stockpiling canned goods and dried beans, rice and flour, coffee and tea. He had books from the library in Millerton, classics he'd meant to read for years but never found time. Now he had nothing but time, and he read by lantern light until his eyes grew heavy. Steinbeck and Hemingway, Abbey and Stegner, writers who understood the West and solitude and what it meant to be stripped down to essentials. But it was the journal that became his real companion. He'd started it almost by accident, jotting notes about the construction. But it evolved into something deeper, a place to process thoughts he'd never spoken aloud, feelings he'd buried under decades of just getting through the day. He wrote about the marriage, trying to understand where it had gone wrong. Not to assign blame, but to learn, to see patterns he'd missed while living them. Barbara had needed someone present, engaged, willing to build a life together rather than just occupy the same space. He'd needed purpose beyond providing, beyond showing up at a job that slowly erased him. They'd both needed things the other couldn't give, and rather than face that truth, they'd just drifted further apart until an affair became the excuse to end what had already died. He wrote about his children, the guilt he carried for the pain his choices had caused them. Shelley's loyalty split between parents, Keith's escape to the other side of the world. How do you apologize for destroying the foundation of someone's childhood, even if that foundation was already cracked? He wrote about his family, Loretta's judgment, Stanley's disappointment, Gwendolyn's worried silence. How their concern felt like condemnation, their help like chains. The realization that he'd spent his entire adult life seeking their approval, measuring himself by their standards, and it had left him hollow. Most importantly, he wrote about what he was learning. That happiness wasn't a destination but a practice. That purpose came from doing, not achieving. That he'd spent 52 years trying to prove he was enough to everyone else, when the only person who needed convincing was himself. The cold tested him. A week in December brought temperatures below 0, the kind of cold that penetrated everything. His water jugs froze despite being kept near the stove. Pipes he'd insulated developed ice that took hours to thaw. He wore every layer he owned and still shivered, feeding the stove constantly, burning through wood faster than he'd planned. Then the flu hit. It started as a tickle in his throat, easy to dismiss, but by evening he was feverish and weak. The next 3 days passed in a haze of sweating and chills, forcing himself to tend the fire, to drink water, to eat even though food tasted like cardboard. There was no one to call for help, no urgent care nearby. Just him and his body fighting, hoping the body would win. It did, but barely. On the 4th day, the fever broke, and he woke weak but clear-headed. He'd lost weight he couldn't afford to lose. The cabin was cold. He'd let the fire die to embers. It took him an hour to get it going properly again, and by then he was exhausted. He lay on his sleeping bag in the loft, looking up at the rough wood ceiling he'd installed, and understood viscerally what true isolation meant. If something went really wrong out here, he might die before anyone found him. The thought didn't terrify him the way it should have. Instead, it clarified things. Every day was a choice to be here, to commit to this life, to accept the risks along with the rewards. He could leave, go back to safety and electricity and grocery stores. But what would he be going back to? An apartment, Sunday dinners full of judgment, a life that had stopped being his own so long ago. He'd forgotten what ownership felt like. He stayed. Christmas Eve brought a surprise. Shelley and Keith arrived together, having parked at the Fire Road entrance and hiked the last 2 miles on snowshoes. Vincent heard them before he saw them, voices carrying through the winter-still forest, and when they emerged into the clearing, he felt something in his chest crack open. Keith looked different, thinner, older, the constant stress of his finance job visible in the lines around his eyes. He stood staring at the cabin with an expression Vincent couldn't read. "Dad, this is where you've been? Living like this?" The judgment was there, but softer than Vincent expected. They came inside, and he showed them around. The efficient layout, the clever storage, the way the stone walls worked with the stove. Keith asked technical questions, his analyst's mind engaging with the engineering, despite his obvious discomfort. They cooked Christmas dinner together, venison stew from meat Floyd had given Vincent, vegetables from cans, biscuits baked in the wood stove that came out surprisingly well. The conversation was awkward at first, decades of family dysfunction not easily overcome by one meal. But Keith started asking about the construction process, genuinely curious, and Vincent found himself explaining choices and challenges, the satisfaction of solving problems with limited resources. "You did all this alone?" "With hand tools? Mostly. Maurice helped with the beam. Shelley helped with finishing work. But yeah, mostly alone." Keith was quiet for a long time, staring into his stew. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "I couldn't do this. I make 6 figures and live in a high-rise, and I don't know how to build anything. Can't fix anything. Don't actually know how to do anything except move money around spreadsheets. That's a valuable skill, is it?" Keith looked up, and Vincent saw something broken in his son's eyes. "I work 80 hours a week for money I don't have time to spend, for a company that would replace me tomorrow if I dropped dead, in a city where I have no friends and no life. Maybe you're not crazy, Dad. Maybe you just figured something out that took me going to the other side of the world to even start questioning." They talked late into the night, the 3 of them, in a way they hadn't since Keith and Shelley were children. Keith admitted his job was destroying him. Shelley confessed her own struggles with purpose and meaning. And Vincent shared what he'd learned, that you can't build a meaningful life on someone else's blueprint, that society's definition of success might not match your own, that sometimes everything has to fall apart before you can rebuild it right. Christmas morning, Keith helped Vincent split firewood and repair a section of roof where snow had caused minor damage. Working together, the distance between them narrowed. When they left that afternoon, Keith's embrace was genuine, not obligatory. "Can I come back? Maybe stay for a week this summer. Any time you want." Alone again, Vincent sat by the stove and wrote in his journal, counting the year's transformations, from broken and homeless to builder and homeowner, from family disappointment to someone his children wanted to visit, from a man running from himself to a man finally comfortable in his own skin. The cabin stood solid around him, proof that he could create something lasting. But more than that, it was proof that starting over wasn't failure, it was courage. March arrived with the tentative promise of spring. Snow still blanketed the clearing, but the sun held warmth now, and icicles dripped from the cabin's eaves in a constant rhythm. Vincent had survived his first winter in the cabin, and the achievement felt monumental. He'd faced isolation, illness and cold that penetrated bone, and he'd endured. More than endured, he'd found a peace so deep it felt like bedrock beneath everything else. The ranger's truck appeared on the first clear day the fire road was passable, and Vincent knew immediately something was wrong. Rangers didn't just visit for friendly conversation. The man who got out was young, maybe 30, wearing the official uniform and an apologetic expression that made Vincent's stomach tighten. "Mr. Aldridge, I'm Ranger Peterson. I need to deliver this to you personally." He held out an official envelope, State Land Management Department embossed on the corner. Vincent opened it standing there in the melting snow, reading words that didn't make sense at first, then made too much sense. The state was reassessing underutilized public lands. The clearing and 50 surrounding acres had been marked for commercial logging auction. He had 60 days to vacate. Failure to comply would result in legal action and forcible removal. "I'm sorry," Peterson said, and seemed to mean it. "I saw what you built here. It's impressive. But the decision came from the capital. Budget shortfalls, pressure to monetize assets. I'm just the messenger." Vincent couldn't speak. The ranger handed him additional paperwork, auction details, contact information, appeal procedures that read like they'd been written specifically to discourage appeals. Then he drove away, leaving Vincent standing in the clearing between his cabin and the stone cliffs, holding papers that said none of it belonged to him. 8 months of work. Every nail, every board, every hour of labor. The first real home he'd felt in decades. The place where he'd found himself again. And bureaucrats in the capital had decided trees were worth more than any of that. He spent the next 2 days in a fog, going through motions, feeding the stove, melting snow, eating without tasting. At night, he lay in the loft, staring at the ceiling he'd built, thinking about Loretta's letter that he'd burned, her words about embracing fantasy. Maybe she'd been right. Maybe this was always temporary, a dream that couldn't survive contact with reality. On the 3rd day, he drove to the county seat and spent hours in the land records office, reading statutes and precedents until the words blurred together. His temporary land use permit granted him nothing, no rights, no standing, no protection. The state owned the land and could do with it as they pleased. Legally, he was a squatter, and squatters could be removed. But there had to be something. He'd seen Maurice fight off developers who wanted his salvage yard. He'd heard stories of ranchers preserving family land against government seizure. There had to be a way. He found Prudence Hall's office above an insurance agency in Millerton. She was 58, with grey hair pulled back severe, and eyes that had seen every variety of human foolishness. The sign on her door said, "Land Use Attorney, consultation by appointment only." Vincent walked in without an appointment. She listened to his story without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When he finished, she sat back and studied him with an expression he couldn't read. "Legally, you have almost no standing. The land was never yours. The state has every right to sell it." Vincent's heart sank. "But," she continued, "there's a clause in the State Land Management Act for cultural and historical preservation. If you can prove the site has unique value, environmental, historical, cultural, there's grounds for appeal. Also, there's a mandatory public comment period before any land sale. That's where community pressure can make a difference." "How much would this cost?" "For you, nothing. I retired from environmental law 3 years ago, got tired of defending corporations. What you've done out there," she gestured vaguely toward the mountains, "that means something. I'll do it pro bono. But you need to understand, we're fighting uphill. They want the money from that timber sale." Vincent left her office with something he hadn't had in 3 days: hope. Maurice reacted exactly as Vincent expected. "You're not losing that place. Not without a fight." He immediately started making calls, mobilizing the network of people who'd helped Vincent build. Within 2 days, there was a committee, Save the Clearing, and a town meeting scheduled. The meeting packed the church social hall. Ranchers, shop owners, teachers, retirees, people Vincent had come to know over the months, showed up prepared to fight. Beatrice had printed petitions. Floyd brought environmental studies showing the stone formations created a microclimate that supported rare plant species. A local historian named Carl had researched the stones and found evidence they'd been a native gathering site 2 centuries ago. "This isn't just about one man's cabin," Maurice said to the assembled group. "It's about what kind of community we want to be. Do we protect what's meaningful, or do we let everything be sacrificed to the highest bidder?" The story spread beyond Millerton. A reporter from the regional newspaper wrote a piece. "Man finds home between the stones. Now state wants to take it." The article went viral online, picked up by larger outlets. Suddenly Vincent was getting messages from strangers, people inspired by his story, offering support, sharing their own tales of starting over. The logging company pushed back hard, lobbying legislators, producing economic studies showing jobs and tax revenue. The comment section on articles split between support and criticism. Some called Vincent an inspiration. Others called him a squatter blocking economic development, a romantic fool standing in the way of progress. Vincent tried to stay grounded, reading both perspectives, understanding he'd somehow become symbolic of larger tensions, rural versus urban values, individual rights versus economic necessity, preservation versus development. He hadn't meant to start a fight. He'd just wanted a place to live. Then his phone rang. Shelley, her voice tight with emotion. "Dad, I saw the article." "What can I do?" Keith called an hour later. "Whatever legal fees you need, I've got them covered." Then, unexpectedly, his mother called a family meeting. She summoned all her children and demanded they support Vincent. Stanley told him about it afterward, how Loretta had resisted, how Hazel had issued an ultimatum. "Because he's your brother, and because he's done something real." Stanley had sided with Vincent immediately. Gwendolyn admitted she'd driven to the clearing the previous month without telling anyone. "The cabin is beautiful, Vince, really beautiful." Loretta had been cornered, agreed reluctantly, but Stanley said there was something else in her resistance. Not anger at Vincent, but envy. Her successful life suddenly felt hollow compared to his transformation. She'd been following everyone else's script while he'd written his own. "We'll all testify at the hearing," Stanley said. "Whatever you need." Vincent sat in his cabin that night, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. He'd built this place alone, but the fight to keep it had revealed a community he hadn't fully recognized. People who saw past his failures to his determination, who valued what he'd created, who understood that some things mattered more than their monetary value. He wrote in his journal, "Whatever happens at the hearing, I've already won. I found myself here. I found people who see me, not my mistakes. I found proof that starting over is possible. But God, I want to keep this place. It's not just a cabin, it's home." 6 weeks until the hearing, Vincent and Prudence built their case with the methodical precision of people who understood they had one chance to get it right. She arrived at the clearing with a botanist from the state university, a woman named Dr. Chen, who spent 3 days documenting plant species. The stone formations created microclimates, she explained, pockets of different temperatures and humidity that allowed species to thrive outside their normal ranges. Rare ferns grew in the shadowed crevices, wildflowers that shouldn't exist this far north clustered near the creek. "This is ecologically significant," Dr. Chen said, photographing a particular moss formation. "Logging would destroy temperature-sensitive species that have likely been here for centuries." A historical consultant confirmed what Carl had discovered. The stones had been a gathering site for indigenous peoples, evidenced by tool fragments and fire-scarred rocks. Not a major site, but culturally significant nonetheless. Prudence documented everything, building a portfolio of evidence that the clearing had value beyond board feet of timber. Vincent compiled photographs spanning the construction, the empty clearing, the foundation stakes, the rising walls, the completed cabin. Shelley helped him organize them chronologically, creating a visual narrative of transformation. Each image was proof of what could be built with determination and time, what could rise from nothing if you were willing to do the work. He wrote his testimony longhand first, revised it dozens times until the words felt true without being melodramatic. Prudence coached him on delivery. Stay calm, state facts, convey passion without anger. The board needed to see him as credible, not emotional. They practiced until his hands stopped shaking when he spoke, until he could tell his story without his voice breaking. The preparation consumed him. He woke at night thinking about arguments he should make, evidence he should present. Sleep became elusive, his mind racing through scenarios, most of them ending with bulldozers and burned bridges, and him back in that apartment with thin walls. Maurice organized the community response with military efficiency. The Save the Clearing Committee met weekly at the diner, coordinating testimony, assigning tasks. Floyd would speak to environmental impact. Beatrice would address economic value, tourism, inspiration, the intangible worth of Vincent's story. A teacher named Patricia would bring letters from her students, children who'd written about what the cabin meant to them as a symbol of perseverance. The local newspaper ran a series on the case, interviewing Vincent, the logging company, state officials. Television news picked it up. The visual of the cabin between ancient stones was too compelling to ignore. A documentary crew from a regional station spent a day filming, interviewing Vincent about his journey. The footage aired during evening news, shots of the cabin, the creek, Vincent explaining how he'd integrated the structure with the landscape. The response was overwhelming. Messages flooded in from across the country. People who'd started over after loss, who'd rebuilt from nothing, who saw their own struggles reflected in Vincent's story. But there was criticism too. Comment sections filled with accusations that he was a squatter, entitled "blocking legitimate economic development." Some pointed out the irony of a man living off the land, opposing its commercial use. Others questioned why one person's feelings should outweigh community economic needs. Vincent read both perspectives, trying to stay balanced. Floyd found him one evening staring at his phone, reading comment after comment. "Stop that," Floyd said, taking the phone and pocketing it. "You know what's true. Don't let strangers who've never been here tell you different." The logging company lobbied hard. They had resources Vincent couldn't match: lawyers, consultants, political connections. Their economic impact study was professionally produced, showing millions in revenue, projected job creation, responsible harvest practices. They weren't villains, Vincent realized. They were business people doing business, and he was an obstacle. A week before the hearing, Loretta visited alone. She pulled up in her luxury sedan, looking out of place against the rustic clearing, wearing clothing too nice for forest dirt. Vincent braced for judgment, for her familiar criticism dressed as concern. Instead, she walked the clearing in silence, taking in every detail: the cabin's craftsmanship, the way it fit between the stones, the small vegetable garden Vincent had started. She touched the wood, tested the sturdiness of the porch rail, looked through the windows at the interior he'd finished. Finally, she turned to him with tears in her eyes. "I owe you an apology. A real one." They sat by the creek and she told him things he'd never known. How she'd built her successful career by following everyone else's rules, measuring achievement by external standards. How her marriage was more performance than partnership. How she'd spent years being who others expected rather than who she was. Seeing Vincent break free had terrified her. It meant she could have done the same, that her safe choices had cost her something essential. "I called you a failure because I was scared you'd be happy," she said, voice breaking. "And you're genuinely happy, and it makes me look at my big house and successful career and realize how empty it all feels." Vincent reached for grace rather than vindication. "It's never too late, Loretta. That's what this place taught me. You can start over at any age, remake your life according to your own values. It's terrifying, but it's possible." They worked together that afternoon, Loretta helping organize presentation materials. Her professional skills proved valuable. She knew how to construct arguments, how to present information compellingly. She created a visual narrative that wove together the ecological, historical, and human elements into something greater than their parts. That evening, sitting by the fire, she admitted she was considering leaving real estate, maybe teaching or working with her hands. Something real, she said, something that felt like hers. "Whatever you choose it because it's yours," Vincent said. "Not because it looks good, or pays well, or impresses people at dinner parties. Choose it because it makes you feel alive." Before she left, she promised, "I'll be at the hearing, and I'll make them listen." The night before the hearing, Vincent sat alone in the cabin he'd built, reviewing testimony he'd memorized weeks ago. He walked the clearing in darkness, memorizing textures and sounds. The creek's murmur, wind in the pines, stone walls solid and eternal under his hands. His journal entry that night was simple. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I've already won. I found myself here, but I desperately want to stay." Morning arrived too soon and too slowly. He dressed in clothes Stanley had loaned him, a suit that fit reasonably well, shoes he wasn't used to wearing. Looking in the small mirror, he saw someone older, weathered but whole. The man staring back had survived loss and rebuilt from ruins. That man could handle whatever came next. Shelley and Keith arrived at dawn to drive him to the capital, 3 hours south. The journey passed in supportive silence, Keith occasionally reaching over to grip his shoulder, Shelley holding his hand. The landscape changed from mountains to foothills to urban sprawl, and Vincent felt his anxiety rising with each mile toward civilization. The state building loomed modern and impersonal, all glass and concrete. But outside, standing in clusters, were people he knew, Maurice, Beatrice, Floyd, dozens from Millerton who'd made the trip. And his family, all of them. His 4 siblings, Hazel in her wheelchair, both his children, united for perhaps the first time in his adult life. Vincent stood looking at them, overwhelmed. "They don't deserve this." Hazel reached up and took his hand. "You earned it. Now go show them what you're made of." They filed into the hearing room together, a small army against institutional power, and Vincent understood that whatever the decision, he wasn't facing it alone. The hearing room was designed for bureaucracy. Fluorescent lights, acoustic tile ceiling, rows of chairs facing a raised platform where 5 commissioners sat behind nameplates and microphones. Vincent recognized the dynamic immediately from his construction management days. Institutional power, comfortable in its authority, prepared to process this as procedure rather than principle. The commissioners were a study in professional detachment. Chairman Randolph, 60-something with silver hair and a face that suggested he'd heard every appeal and denied most of them. Commissioner Augusta, sitting to his left, a former park ranger according to Prudence's research, her expression more engaged than the others. 3 more commissioners whose body language ranged from bored to skeptical. The logging company brought 3 lawyers in expensive suits, their presentation materials professionally bound and stacked precisely. They looked like what they were, people who did this for a living, who understood how these hearings worked, who'd probably never lost one. Prudence sat beside Vincent at the appellant's table, calm and professional. Behind them, the gallery was packed. Supporters from Millerton, his family, media with cameras and recording devices. The air felt charged, expectant. Chairman Randolph gavelled the hearing to order, his voice carrying the practiced monotone of someone reading from a script. State Land Management had identified the parcel as underutilized, suitable for commercial harvest. The auction would proceed unless compelling evidence suggested alternative designation. He said it like he'd said it 100 times before. The logging company presented first. Their lead attorney, a man named Stevenson with perfect hair and perfect teeth, approached the podium with the confidence of someone who'd already won. He laid out their case methodically, timber value assessments, harvest plans, replanting schedules. Numbers and charts projected on screens, everything quantified and optimized. This parcel represents approximately $8.3 million in timber value, Stevenson said, his voice smooth and certain. Our harvest plan would create 72 jobs over 18 months, generate substantial tax revenue, and employ sustainable forestry practices with full replanting within 5 years. He characterized Vincent respectfully but dismissively, a well-meaning individual who'd made unauthorized use of public land. We sympathize with Mr. Aldridge's situation. However, public land cannot be claimed through sentiment. The law is clear on this matter, and precedent supports removal of unauthorized structures. Their expert witness, a state land policy specialist, testified about the dangers of allowing individual occupation. The slippery slope argument: if Vincent could stay, why not anyone? Public lands would become a patchwork of squatters. Management would become impossible. He cited cases, precedents, regulations, building a legal wall that felt impenetrable. Vincent watched the commissioners' faces. Randolph nodded along, clearly aligned with the logging interests. 2 others checked their phones occasionally, their boredom barely concealed. But Augusta listened carefully, taking notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about environmental impact and replanting success rates. When the logging company finished, Prudence approached the podium, carrying the portfolio they'd assembled. She started by reframing the question. This hearing isn't about economics versus sentiment. It's about defining the highest use of public land. What serves the public interest most? A temporary extraction of timber or permanent preservation of ecological and cultural significance? She presented Dr. Chen's findings: the rare plant species, the microclimate created by the stone formations, the ecological value that would be destroyed by logging. She presented the historical consultant's evidence, the indigenous gathering site, the cultural significance of the stones themselves. She presented photographs showing the integration of Vincent's cabin with the landscape, arguing it enhanced rather than damaged the site. The State Land Management Act explicitly allows for cultural and historical preservation. This site qualifies on multiple grounds. Moreover, Mr. Aldridge's presence has generated significant public interest and tourism to the region, creating economic value that's harder to quantify but no less real. Commissioner Augusta asked about the specifics of the microclimates, clearly interested. Randolph looked impatient, ready to move on. The other commissioners remained inscrutable. The public comment period opened. Maurice went first, his gravelly voice carrying conviction. I've known Vincent Aldridge for 8 months. He's not a squatter, he's a neighbor. He works hard, helps others, contributes to our community. He built something beautiful on land nobody cared about until someone else wanted it. That says everything about what we value. Beatrice spoke about economic impact beyond timber. Since Vincent's story went public, we've had people visit Millerton specifically to see the area. They eat at our restaurants, shop at our stores. His inspiration is worth something too. We've received letters from people who changed their lives after hearing his story. How do you quantify hope? Floyd addressed environmental concerns. I've ranched this area 40 years. The creek watershed feeds into larger systems. Logging would cause erosion, destroy habitat, damage water quality for miles downstream. The rare plant species Dr. Chen documented, once they're gone forever. You can plant new trees, but you can't recreate an ecosystem that took centuries to develop. The local historian Carl presented archaeological evidence, his voice shaking with passion. These stones aren't just rocks. They're heritage. Our indigenous peoples gathered here for generations. We found tool fragments, fire pits, evidence of continuous use over centuries. Logging would destroy sites that help us understand our region's history. Each testimony chipped away at the purely economic argument, building a counter-narrative of value that couldn't be reduced to dollars per board foot. The commissioners listened with varying degrees of attention. Augusta's notes filled multiple pages. Randolph checked his watch. The outcome felt balanced on a knife edge. A teacher spoke about her students' letters, how Vincent's story had taught them about perseverance. A retired couple who'd visited the clearing described its peaceful beauty. A veteran talked about how the cabin inspired him to start rebuilding after his own losses. Person after person offered testimony that transformed Vincent from appellant to symbol of second chances, of human resilience, of finding purpose in simplicity. But the logging company's lawyers looked unworried. They had law and precedent on their side. They had economic projections and employment numbers. They had commissioners who'd probably heard 100 versions of this same story and ruled the same way every time. Vincent felt the weight of institutional power, the system designed to resist exactly this kind of individual appeal. He thought about the cabin, about morning coffee watching sunrise through the stones, about the peace he'd found in that clearing. All of it might be gone in an hour. Prudence returned to her seat and whispered, "Your turn. Remember what we practiced, calm, factual, but let them see what this means to you." Vincent stood, his legs unsteady, and walked to the podium. The room fell silent. Cameras focused on him. His family watched with expressions of hope and worry. Maurice gave him a slight nod. "You've got this." He placed his grandfather's hammer on the podium, the worn wood handle catching the fluorescent light, and began to speak. "My name is Vincent Aldridge. I'm 52 years old. 10 months ago, I lost my marriage, my job, and everything I thought defined me as a man. I understand you've heard my background, so I won't repeat it. What I want to talk about is what happened after the loss." Vincent's voice was steady, though his hands gripped the podium. "I found a clearing between two stone formations. Nobody wanted it. Nobody cared about it. It was just empty space on a map. And I decided to build something there." He described the construction process with enough technical detail to demonstrate genuine skill, the foundation challenges, integrating with the stone walls, the engineering required to make it work. The commissioners listened, and even Randolph seemed slightly more engaged. "But this isn't really about a cabin," Vincent continued, shifting tone. "It's about what that land gave me. I was lost. Not just homeless, but lost. I didn't know who I was anymore, outside of the roles I'd failed at. Husband, provider, employee. That clearing became my path back to myself." He paused, gathering courage for vulnerability. "I understand the economic arguments. I understand the law. I'm not asking you to ignore either, but I am asking you to understand what this place represents. Not just for me, for anyone who's ever needed to start over. If you approve this sale, you're not just removing a cabin. You're saying that second chances have no value, that transformation doesn't matter, that a person's worth is measured only in revenue." He placed his hand on the hammer. "This hammer is 3 generations old. My grandfather used it to build his house. He taught me, measure twice, cut once. Build things that last. I've tried to do that, not just with wood, but with my life. I failed once. I lost everything. And I used that failure as a foundation to build something better." His voice strengthened. "The logging company talks about $8 million in timber. But what's the value of proving you can rebuild? What's the value of showing other people who've lost everything, that starting over is possible? What's the value of a place that teaches you who you actually are instead of who you're supposed to be?" He concluded simply, "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for recognition that some things are worth more than money. This clearing is one of them. Thank you." He returned to his seat, hands trembling, feeling exposed and exhausted. Prudence squeezed his shoulder. "You did well." Shelley approached the podium next, and Vincent saw tears already forming in her eyes. "I'm Vincent's daughter. I'm here to tell you what I witnessed over these months." She described his state after the divorce, broken, defeated, barely functional. Then the transformation she saw with each visit. "My father didn't run away. He rebuilt. There's a difference." She pulled out his journal, worn and stained from use. "I asked Dad if I could read something he wrote. This is from January, middle of winter." Her voice broke as she read, "Today I realized I haven't felt ashamed in 3 months. Not of who I am, what I've lost, or what I'm doing. The silence here isn't empty, it's full of possibility. I'm learning that starting over isn't failure, it's courage." She looked up at the commissioners, tears streaming. "That's my dad. That's who he became up there. Please don't take that away from him. Don't take it away from anyone who needs to see that transformation is possible." Keith followed, brief but powerful. I'm Vincent's son. I work in finance. I understand spreadsheets and profit margins better than most people. But I also understand that what my father built can't be measured on a balance sheet. The value is in the proof that you can lose everything and still build something meaningful. That's worth preserving. Then Loretta, his harshest critic, approached the podium. I'm Vincent's sister. I didn't support my brother when he needed it. I judged him harshly, called his choices foolish, told him he was embarrassing the family. She paused, composing herself. I was wrong. He's done something remarkable, something I didn't have the courage to do. He chose authenticity over approval, purpose over prestige. I'm asking you to recognize that, please. The board called a 30-minute recess to deliberate. Vincent and his supporters waited in tense silence. Speculation whispered through the gallery. Augusta seemed moved, but would it be enough? Randolph was clearly against them. The other 3 commissioners remained impossible to read. They needed 3 votes out of 5. Prudence's assessment was cautious. It's close, very close. Your testimony was strong, your family's support was powerful, but they have law and precedent and economics. It could go either way. Vincent sat with his eyes closed, not praying exactly, but sending intention into the universe. Not for victory, but for fair consideration. For the commissioners to see beyond procedure to principle. For them to understand that some decisions matter more than their economic impact. The board returned. Faces neutral, professionally composed. Augusta would announce the decision. That felt significant, but Vincent couldn't tell if it was good or bad. The room fell into absolute silence, everyone holding their breath. Augusta cleared her throat, looked down at papers in front of her, then directly at Vincent. The board has reviewed all evidence and testimony presented today. We've considered the economic value of the timber, the legal precedents regarding public land use, and the arguments for cultural and historical preservation. Vincent's heart hammered so hard he could barely hear over it. By a vote of 3-2, the board has decided. Augusta paused, and Vincent couldn't breathe. To redesignate the parcel as a cultural heritage site. Mr. Aldridge will be granted a 30-year lease with option to renew, contingent on maintaining the site and allowing limited educational access. The room exploded. Cheers, applause, tears. Vincent sat frozen, unable to process what he'd heard. 3-2. He'd won. The cabin, the clearing, the home he'd built. He could stay. Shelley and Keith were hugging him, Maurice pounding his back, Loretta crying openly. Prudence was shaking his hand, saying something about conditions and paperwork, but Vincent couldn't focus on words. He could only feel relief, gratitude, joy so intense it was almost painful. He'd fought institutional power and won, not through money or connections, but through community, through the value of his story, through proving that transformation mattered. The clearing between the stones was his to keep, and with it, the life he'd rebuilt from nothing. 3 months after the hearing, summer had transformed the clearing into something lush and vibrant. Wildflowers, Vincent couldn't name, bloomed along the creek bank. The vegetable garden he'd expanded was producing more than he could eat alone. The cabin had settled into the landscape as if it had always been there. Weathered wood blending with stone, the whole thing looking less like construction and more like natural emergence. Vincent had added a small guest structure, just one room with a sleeping loft, built from leftover materials and techniques he'd mastered over the year. The 30-year lease came with conditions he'd accepted gladly. He had to allow limited public access, guided visits to the stone formations for educational purposes. Once a month, he opened the clearing to visitors who wanted to see what he'd built, to hear his story, to understand how someone could lose everything and still find a way forward. The visitors came in small groups, always respectful, often tearful. They'd walk the clearing, study the cabin's integration with the stones, ask questions about construction and survival and how he'd found the courage to start over. Vincent discovered he was good at this, not preaching or lecturing, but simply sharing what he'd learned through experience. Letters arrived weekly, forwarded through Prudence's office. People who'd heard his story and decided to make changes in their own lives. A woman leaving an abusive marriage. A man quitting a job that was destroying him. Retirees selling big houses to live simpler lives. Each letter was a reminder that his struggle had meant something beyond himself. Shelley visited twice a month now, often bringing her partner Greg. They'd spend weekends helping with projects, a new storage shed, an improved water system, a root cellar dug into the hillside. The work brought them closer, creating the relationship they'd never quite managed when Vincent was trapped in his old life. Keith had spent 3 weeks that summer, taking remote work and living in the guest cabin. Vincent watched his son relax day by day, the constant tension in his shoulders gradually easing. They'd built a stone fire pit together, working side by side in comfortable silence, and Keith admitted he was considering leaving finance for something that used his hands instead of just his mind. Even Stanley and Gwendolyn visited occasionally, bringing grandchildren who ran around the clearing shrieking with the particular joy of kids discovering the woods. The family bonds were healing, not back to what they were, that life was gone, but forward into something more authentic. Loretta came most often. She'd quit real estate, enrolled in woodworking classes, and was building furniture in her garage. She'd bring her projects to show Vincent, asking for advice, learning techniques. The sister who'd judged him most harshly had become the one most changed by his example. His mother Hazel visited one last time in July, her health clearly declining. They sat by the creek, not talking much, just being together. She held his hand with papery fingers and said, "You found what matters, Vincent. That's all I ever wanted for any of you." She passed 2 weeks later, peacefully in her sleep. At the funeral, the family gathered without the old tensions. They'd been united by supporting Vincent, and that unity had revealed how much energy they'd wasted on judgment and comparison. Hazel's death was sad, but not tragic. She'd lived fully and died knowing her children had finally found their ways. Vincent's daily life had settled into rhythms that felt permanent rather than temporary. Morning coffee on the porch, watching sunrise paint the stone cliffs in shades of gold and amber. Days spent maintaining the property, guiding occasional visitors, carving small wooden items he'd started selling at Beatrice's store. Evenings by the fire, reading or writing in his journal, documenting lessons learned and moments of grace. Maurice stopped by regularly, always with some excuse. Needed to drop off materials, had extra food, just passing through. They'd sit on the porch, drinking coffee, talking or not talking, the friendship deepening through shared silence and occasional wisdom. On a late afternoon in August, a car pulled up tentatively. A woman got out, mid-50s, wearing exhaustion and uncertainty like clothes that didn't quite fit. She stood looking at the cabin with an expression Vincent recognized, hope fighting with fear. "I know this might seem strange," she said, voice shaking, "but I've been following your story. I recently got divorced, lost my job, and I'm trying to figure out what comes next. Could I just sit here for a while?" Vincent smiled, gesturing to the chairs on the porch. "Stay as long as you need." He made tea while she cried quietly. Then they talked. Or mostly she talked and he listened. The same story with different details. Loss, judgment, searching for solid ground. When she asked how he'd found the courage to start over, Vincent thought carefully before answering. "You don't need permission to rebuild your life. You just need to take the first step." Then the next one. The courage comes from doing, not from feeling ready. She left as the sun was setting, thanking him repeatedly, looking lighter somehow. Vincent watched her drive away and knew she'd find her path, just as he'd found his. Shelley arrived for their weekly dinner tradition, bringing groceries and news from the world beyond the clearing. They cooked together in the small kitchen, conversation flowing easily, laughter genuine. After dinner, sitting by the fire, she asked the question she'd asked a dozen times before. "Are you happy, Dad?" Vincent looked around the cabin, every board and nail placed by his own hands, every corner holding memories of challenge and triumph. Through the window, he could see the stone cliffs standing eternal, the clearing peaceful in twilight. His daughter sat beside him, present by choice rather than obligation. Outside, people were rebuilding their lives inspired by his example. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I really am." Later, Alone on the porch, Vincent carved the final touches into a wooden sign he'd been working on for weeks. In careful letters it read, "Second Chances Clearing." Tomorrow he'd mount it at the entrance, a message to anyone who needed to see it, that starting over wasn't failure, that transformation was always possible, that a life could be rebuilt from ruins if you were willing to do the work. The stars emerged one by one, visible between the stone walls, and Vincent sat watching them appear. The clearing was silent, except for the creek's murmur and wind in the pines. A place between two ancient rocks where a man had found himself and opened the door for others to do the same. He'd lost everything and gained something more valuable: authenticity, purpose, peace. The cabin would stand as proof that second chances were real, that it was never too late to rebuild your life according to your own values, and that sometimes the best thing you can build isn't shelter, but a way home to yourself.